Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Mr. West Reads. Today we are going to start The Ice Monster by David Walliams. I know we started the other book yesterday, Goodnight, Mr. Tom, but I decided it probably wasn't the best book to be reading for you guys, so I went and got this one, which I think is a really good. So we'll have plenty to go at. So, chapter 1. The year is 1899 and we're in Victorian London. Meet the characters in the story. So this is Elsie. Elsie is a homeless orphan who lives on the streets of London. This is Dottie. Dottie is the cleaning lady at the Natural History Museum. She is as daft as her brushes. This is Private Thomas. And Private Thomas is Dottie's boyfriend, the shortest soldier who ever served in the British Army. His fellow soldiers called him Titch. He is now retired and lives at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, making him a Chelsea pensioner. This is Mrs. Curdle. Mrs. Curdle is the nasty old boot who runs Wormley Hall, the home for unwanted children. And this is this one is Mr. Clout. And Mr. Clout is the brute of a security guard at the museum, infamous for his hobnailed boots. Interesting. This is Commissioner Barker. And Commissioner Barker is the fearsome head of the London Metropolitan Police, famous for his tiny moustache. This is the Professor. This one. And the Professor, many years ago, the Professor was the top scientist at the museum until one of his experiments went catastrophically wrong. This is Lady Buckshot. And Lady Buckshot is an aristocratic big game hunter. Across Africa, she shoots elephants, giraffes, and lions and brings their bodies back to the museum to be stuffed and put on display. Ugh. Oh wow, there are a lot of characters. This is the Admiral. So the Admiral is the only sailor to live at the hospital. He was thrown out of the old sailors' home for being drunk and disorderly. These two are the Colonel and the Brigadier. They are also Chelsea pensioners. And then this is the one-eyed Sergeant Major, who is in charge of everyone and everything that comes in and out of the hospital. And don't you forget it. So I guess including including who else lived there? Private Thomas. They all live at this at the Chelsea Hospital, and then all the Chelsea pensioners are overseen by the by the hospital's formidable matron. So that's matron, and then there is Queen Victoria, who was in charge of Britain at that time, and she was in charge of the British Empire. In 1899, when this book is set, she had been on the throne for what was the longest reign in British history, a staggering 62 years. Her aide is this guy, Abdul Karim, and he is always at the Queen's side. He is her handsome young Indian attendant, also known as Munshi. Sir Ray Lancaster is the museum's Portsley director. That's this guy. And then the sandwich board man roams the streets trying to convince everyone that the end is nigh. So there's his sign, look, that says the end is nigh. And then there is the captain, who is in charge of what was, in 1899, one of the Royal Navy's most modern warships, HMS Argonaut. And so this is the captain. Then there is the Sticky Fingers gang, which is a rough and tough band of child robbers who are infamous for being the greatest thieves in London. And this is them. So there are lots of them. And then Raj the First has his own confectionery emporium or sweet trolley. So this is Raj. And then there is the Ice Monster itself. A woolly mammoth that died 10,000 years ago. The lifeless animal was discovered by Arctic explorers, and it is perfectly preserved in ice. So this is the ice monster, which I think that's that guy. Wow, there's a cool map of London, which we may need to go back to at various times during the book. So we're now ready. Part 1. So this is London in 1899. Chapter 1. Cockroaches for breakfast. Ooh. One bleak winter night in the streets of London, a tiny baby was left on the steps of an orphanage. There was no note, no name, no clue as to who this little person was, just a potato sack in which she was wrapped as snow fell around her. In Victorian times, it was not uncommon for newborn babies to be abandoned outside orphanages, hospitals, or even the homes of upper-class folk. Their poor, desperate mothers hoped their children would be taken in and given a better life than their birth families could provide. However, it was hard to imagine a worse start in life for this baby than at Wormley Hall, the home for unwanted children. 26 orphans lived there, all crammed into a room that should have slept 8 at the absolute most. The children were locked up, starved, and beaten. On top of that, they were forced to work day and night. They had to assemble gentlemen's pocket watches from tiny pieces until they went blind. All the children were painfully thin, with filthy rags for clothes. The orphans' faces were black with soot, so all you could see in the gloom were their hopeful little eyes. When a new baby arrived at the orphanage, all the older children would come up with a name for them. They liked to work their way through the alphabet so that their names would be as different as possible. The night the baby in the potato sack was left on the steps, they had reached E. If she had been found the day before, she might have been called Doris. A day later, and she could have been called Frank. Instead, she was named Elsie. This prison of an orphanage was run by an evil old boot named Mrs. Curdle. Her face was usually fixed in a permanent grimace, and she was covered from head to toe in warts. She had so many warts, even her warts had warts. The only thing that made her smile was the sound of children sobbing. Mrs. Curdle would scoff all the food donated for the orphans, so the children in her care had to eat cockroaches for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Creepy crawlies are good for you, she would chuckle. If any of the orphans spoke after candles out, she would stuff one of her pus-sodden old stockings into their mouth. They would have to keep it there for 1 week. That'll keep you quiet, windy wallet. When the children were sleeping on the old cold stone floor, she would put wiggly worms down the backs of their shirts, and they would wake up screaming, "Ah!" Mrs. Curdle would sneeze over the orphans, "Achoo!" and blow her nose on their hair. A weekly bath involved her dunking the orphans one by one into a barrel full of maggots. "The maggots will nibble off the dirt, you muck snipes," Mrs. Curdle would say. To dry off afterwards, she would peg the children onto the washing line by their ears. Once, when Elsie was found with a pet rat in her pocket that she had befriended, Mrs. Curdle used it as a ball in a game of cricket. If she felt one of the orphans had given her a funny look, Mrs. Curdle would poke them in the eye with her dirty, stubby finger. "Take that, jib face." As a special treat at Christmas, the orphans would line up for their present, a whack on the bottom with the bumper book of cards. "Merry Christmas, child," Mrs. Curdle would exclaim with glee on each strike. Elsie endured 10 long, hard years at Wormley Hall. The only thing that kept her going was the dream that one day her ma would magically appear and whisk her away, but she never did. As the girl grew up, she would invent more and more incredible stories about her. Perhaps her ma was a jungle explorer, or an acrobat with the travelling circus. Even better, a lady pirate off having adventures on the high seas. Every night, Elsie would make up bedtime stories for her fellow orphans. Over time, the girl became a magnificent storyteller. She had all the other children in the palm of